Hi guys, welcome to May's Men for Christ video. My name is Colin Walker. I'll be introducing us to Judges 16 this month. Last month we looked at the start of Samson's story in the book of Judges, and this month we finish off our series in Judges in chapter 16. Hopefully you've had a chance to read through the chapter. If you haven't, and you've also not read chapters 13 to 15, the start of Samson's life, then I'd encourage you to pause the video, go back and read that and study it and have a think in your own head as well. I'm not going to give you by any means all the answers on this, and actually I'm going to keep it pretty light because I want us to think about this ourselves. There's not a lot of black and white in terms of looking at Samson and the Israelites and Delilah and thinking, oh, they should have done that, I shouldn't have done that. And anyway, I don't think that's a particularly helpful way to go into the passage and study it, but there's still opinions to be had about it, and it's good to form those opinions yourself from the text. So when we come to discuss it and start thinking of things that apply in our own life, you've kind of already done a bit of the homework, as it were, just by going through the passage. So yeah, let's get into the passage. Last month we saw in chapters 14 and 15 bit of a whirlwind, bit of a weird story going on with Samson. Chapter 14, very negative, a lot of things that he broke in his Nazirite vow, aspects of his life that quite clearly he was just doing whatever he wanted. Chapter 15, he gets handed over by the Israelites, and then we see God's Spirit come and rescue him from his own people having betrayed him. God uses Samson then to obviously defeat the Philistines in this battle with this famous donkey jawbone, killing the 1,000. In response to that, we see Samson praying and reaching out to God, and see God sending water from the rock to preserve his life. So it kind of ends a bit on an up trajectory, I guess. We're kind of seeing a bit more positivity. You can start to think, oh, okay, Samson's made a few bad decisions, but God's obviously rescued him for a reason. He saved his life. He used him to kill these 1,000 Philistines. So surely God's at work in Samson's life, and perhaps also Samson's beginning to realize his need for God, and also hopefully you're kind of thinking at this point that he's going to start partnering with God in terms of rescuing the nations from the Philistines. Well, unfortunately things go downhill again at the start of chapter 16. It's probably about 20 years later from the events of chapter 15. We're not told anything really at all about what happens in the meantime, other than that Samson was the judge of Israel. He was their leader. He was the one they came to help them decide conflicts and seek wisdom and leadership. What's clear though is from chapter 16 is that the Philistines are still very much in control. They are actually the ones leading or ruling over Israel. It's not Samson. It's definitely not God. They are not in submission to God. The Israelites and Samson seem to be pretty comfortable with reality that it's the Philistines ruling over them instead of God. Repeated patterns in Judges that we've seen under most of the previous Judges is Israel turning to do what each person thought was right in his own eyes, God sending an enemy to rule over them, Israel then crying out to God to rescue them, and God raises up a judge who is God's instrument in freeing Israel from its oppressors. The bit that's missing in this instance with Samson is the crying out. The Israelites don't cry out to God for rescue. But note that God still graciously is seeking to raise up Samson as a judge for them. Now it's important to realize that the Israelites aren't seeking this salvation, but God's still trying to rescue them. They don't know that they need rescued, but God's still doing something for them. So make what you want about Samson, but bear in mind the context here is he's trying, well, maybe he's not trying, but God's wanting him to lead this nation to victory, but the nation doesn't want to be saved. So yes, there's issues about Samson's participation in his role as being the leader, but to a certain extent I think it's fair on him to say that he is being dragged down a bit by the entire population's spiritual state, not just his own individual. And that idea of God's grace being lavished upon Israel, preparing a way for them to be saved even whilst they're still in rebellion, should resonate with us. Romans 5:8 should come to mind, that God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So while we were still sinning, God was still putting efforts in place that Christ would come, go to the cross, and make a way for us to be saved. And the same grace that's at work in the cross is at work here for the Israelites. As you read through and study this passage, I encourage you to embrace the emotions of frustration, disappointment, that you might feel towards Israel. Why are you doing that? That's obviously the wrong thing to do. Oh no, don't do that. Don't, you can see where it's going. Why did you do that? That's foolish. That's foolish. You're making bad decisions. And capture some of those emotions, and perhaps be challenged to flip it a bit and go, what would someone think if they read my life story written down, and they read my decisions that I've made in my life written down? So be a bit gracious towards the Israelites, but also hopefully you can use this passage as a mirror to see our own lives held up. That's kind of the direction I want us to go in. Let's look at the Israelites and Samson, and then pivot that round to help us look at ourselves, and the questions that I'll share for us to discuss on Tuesday night hopefully will help us to do that. So I'm not going to teach much more from the passage, but here's a quick tour through a couple of points, I think, just as a sort of starter to get us thinking in our own heads before Tuesday night, and also to discuss on Tuesday. So chapter 16 starts with a pretty bizarre story of Samson, I kind of think arrogantly just wandering into enemy territory. What's now the Gaza Strip, an area slightly further north of that would have been the Philistines' stronghold. That was their region, that was the area of land that they lived in, and the city of Gaza is in the middle of that. And so Samson's walking right in there, doing what he wants. He thinks nobody can touch me, I'm invincible. He is, as before, tempted with his eyes. He sees a woman, a prostitute, goes in, sleeps with her. Word presumably gets to him that the Philistines know you're here, they're setting a trap, they're going to try and capture you. They're obviously not impressed that their leader of their enemy, Israel, coming into their own city. So he gets out at midnight. Instead of just walking through and knocking open the gates that would have been closed for security of the city at night time, instead of just bursting them open and walking out, he actually just rips them out of the ground and carries them off into the distance, just like a beast, just because he can. It seems the city of Hebron's about 60 kilometers away. He probably doesn't carry them that far. It's probably a hill that's generally in that direction, but it could be anywhere between Gaza and Hebron. But anyway, I think it's there just to show us that in 20 years, Samson's character hasn't changed that much, and his weakness for women is still there. And also, generally, he's just going about doing what he wants and going wherever he wants. And that's pretty much similar to what we've seen in the previous two chapters. That all sets the backdrop for Samson's next encounter with a woman, which is actually from his own region. So the geography is back in the area where he grew up, this valley of Sorek, or it's certainly to the west and quite near where he grew up. So historically, I guess I've often viewed, I think I've been led to view Delilah as a Philistine. I haven't read the text again. I'm not just so convinced about that. I think likely she was an Israelite. We're told explicitly the other two women in Samson's life were Philistines, but also when the Philistine lords come and bribe Delilah, they don't command her as you might expect if she was a Philistine. Instead, they give her these 5,500 pieces of silver. I say that because there was likely 5 lords, the Philistines, and they were all offering 1,100 pieces of silver each. So quite a high price to give to someone. So it's probably more trying to buy your enemy with money rather than commanding a Philistine of their own nation. Anyhow, that kind of shows us that Delilah is doing this not as an enemy of Israel, but actually as an Israelite herself. She is representing here Israel's misplaced morality. She's willing to betray her country's leader and her lover. And we see also, of course, that Samson's still vulnerable to all this. Then we have this famous fun and games. She and Samson play with each other, ending up with Samson being captured by the Philistines and led away to Gaza and having his eyes gouged out. In chapter 15, if you remember, when Samson was betrayed the first time, it was Israel's folly and decision making that led to them betraying their leader. They were quite willing to hand Samson over to the enemy just to get peace from the Philistines, because remember they were saying, who do you think you are? The Philistines are our lords. They govern over us. They were just willing to roll over to the Philistines. In this case, you have Delilah, I guess, kind of representing the nation as well, and equally being willing to betray Samson. But Samson's also, in this case, guilty. He's quite willing to go along and make decisions that are going to cost him dearly as well. He should have heard the alarm bells, admittedly, the first time. She betrays him so blatantly these first few times before, and he still stays with her. He still keeps giving her information, either through ignorance that actually maybe that's not what she's up to, but I think it's pretty obvious that she's not on his side at this point, or perhaps just arrogance. Perhaps just he thinks, what, even if I do tell her something, if they do come, the enemy, I'll just destroy them like I have before. But that all costs him dearly, and we read, of course, in verse 20 that he did not know that the Lord's Spirit had left him. So after a few of those glimmers of hope in chapter 15, it all looks very negative. The story of the book of Judges has reached an all-time new low here as their leaders led off by their enemy. However, God still hasn't finished. He's not achieved his purpose of freeing Israel from the Philistines, and so we know the story isn't ended. His eyes gouged out, perhaps less temptations available to him. Samson finally kind of sees that God's desire to destroy the Philistines. He has his chance when he's brought before them, and in this known suicide mission, he obviously destroys the 5 lords, nobles, officials, all the leadership hierarchy really of the Philistines, and so frees Israel in so doing. So despite all the bumps in the way, God does achieve his purpose of freeing Israel. That's important to hold on to. And what's more, Samson does actually turn out to be the instrument through which God achieves his purpose. Now, like me, you're probably thinking, well, surely there were easier ways for Samson to have done that. He could have led them into battle. He's a strong guy, didn't have to use his life to do it. I think that's often the way, isn't it? There's often an easier way for God to achieve his purposes if we are willing to get on board at the start and be willing participants to God in achieving his purposes in this world. If we're not willing instruments for God in our own lives, things that he's trying to achieve and do generally take longer, get more messy, there's more hurt and pain involved, the process is dragged out. Maybe at the end God will achieve his purpose, whether that's teaching us something about him or causing a certain event to happen in our lives or the lives of those around us. God's purposes still prevail, but the method that he has to go through to achieve those very much depends on how obedient and willing we are to be involved in that process. And so that's why I use the word instruments, as in we are instruments in God's hand. We can either be willing instruments or reluctant instruments, or just downright rebellious instruments that just refuse to be used by God. But really that bit decision is up to us, how willing we are to partake with God. In Israel and Samson's case, there were plenty of opportunities for Israel to cry out to God. They didn't. God has shown himself in history to have answered those cries. but they didn't look for him. They didn't cry out. There were plenty of opportunities for Samson to be obedient as a leader. I mean, who wouldn't have followed this guy into battle? He was a beast. You know, the fear that he brought the Philistines was so real. Imagine if he had an army behind him. But again, Israel was quite comfortable living under the Philistines, and so they didn't see battle with the Philistines as something that was needed. And that undoubtedly did make it harder, I think, for Samson to lead them well, with the state of Israel being as it was. However, the main point is that God did achieve his purpose. God kept his faithfulness even when Israel lost theirs. God still was putting plans in motion to redeem and rescue Israel, even when Israel didn't really recognize that it needed to be saved. And if you read on in Judges, even after God has provided this rescue, Israel's in a mess. Morally, the rest of Judges is really hard reading. There's some really weird and bizarre and really bad things going on in the country. So for ourselves, let's aim to learn from the mistakes of those who've gone before us. We are in no better positions than Samson and the Israelites, other than having God's grace in our lives. Let's be reminded of the real threat of complacency and ignorance for us of the world about us. Let us not be as Israelites, where all we're worried about is our little world and we're not bothered what's going on around us. We're not bothered whether God's big plans for this world are being fulfilled or not. Or as Samson was, let us also not be guilty of just blatantly refusing to obediently partake in what God is clearly calling us to do. We can be guilty of these two accusations, both corporately, I think, as the church body, in terms of not recognizing the world that we live in and what God wants to be doing with this world, but also as individuals, we can reject what God has planned for us and wants us to be involved in. So let's encourage one another to be those willing instruments in God's hand, not missing the opportunity, but instead joyfully taking up the calling to explore what God's purposes are for this time. What is God wanting to do in the world, in our generation? And would we be willing participants to see those purposes achieved, but also be right in the middle of what God is doing as the instruments in his hand to achieve those purposes. So I put a few questions out for us to talk through on Tuesday night. There's three kind of sections there. The first one's looking at the passage. The second one moves on to thinking a bit more about what God's up to here, as well as what God's up to in our day, in terms of his grace and how his attitudes are shown towards his people. And the third section, make sure you put plenty of time, ideally kind of a third of your time between each of these three sections is on an application for ourselves. How can we really think about this passage for ourselves? Let's not spend the whole time assassinating Samson's character, but instead think of ourselves and challenge and pray for one another to really commit to living out those applications in our lives. So trust your time Tuesday night is really good, and look forward to seeing you then. God bless.